The chill was the first thing to register. A damp, pre-dawn cold that seeped through my camas and settled deep in my bones. It was a clean cold, sharp and bracing, nothing like the heavy, humid heat that would come later. I stood at the ragged edge of a line of 73 other candidates, a number I'd counted 3 times just to have something solid to focus on. 74 souls, all breathing the same nervous vapor into the Virginia air, all staring at the same dark tree line we'd be running toward soon. In my right hand, my fingers were clenched so tightly the edges of the trident pin bit into my palm. I wasn't supposed to have it. It was my father's. I'd taken it from his old footlocker the night I left, a small, cold piece of steel that weighed more than any pack I'd ever humped. My knuckles were white. The pain was an anchor. You'll never be tough enough, not like them, it's a different kind of hard. The voice was 2 years old, but it echoed in my skull with the clarity of yesterday. It had been the last thing he'd said to me. The period at the end of a lifetime of sentences that were never quite good enough. The memory didn't feel like a memory. It felt like a ghost walking right through me, pulling me out of the present and dumping me back into that stifling, too bright dining room. The china was my mother's good set, the one with the delicate blue ridges along the edges that only came out for holidays and, apparently, for my first leave back home. The smell of roast chicken and lemon thyme filled the room, a familiar comfort that did nothing to soften the tension. My father sat at the head of the table, back ramrod straight even in his own kitchen, his fork and knife moving with a precise, mechanical efficiency. He was still in shape, a man for whom retirement was a change of title, not of habit. My mother, Sarah, passed the basket of rolls to me with a gentle smile that didn't quite reach her worried eyes. "It's so good to have you home, Riley. 2 years in Okinawa. It feels like you just left." "Feels like a lifetime ago," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet room. I'd grown used to the constant background hum of a forward operating base, to the easy, profane camaraderie of my squad. This polite silence was unnerving. My father chewed, swallowed, and took a sip of water. "Lieutenant Sloan," he said, the title sounding less like a rank and more like a question. "How's the platoon?" "They're good, Dad, sharp. The new sergeant is a rock. We topped the battalion's last readiness eval." He gave a single, short nod. It was the highest praise I could expect. A check in the box, met standard. "Good, that's what they pay you for." The conversation lulled. I took a breath, the words I'd been rehearsing for weeks poised on my tongue. This was the moment. I set my own fork down, aligning it perfectly with the edge of my plate. "I put in my application," I said, the words dropping into the quiet like stones. "For the Marine Special Operations Command Selection Pipeline. I got my packet approved. I shipped to assessment and selection in 9 weeks." The silence that followed was absolute. My mother's hand froze, a roll halfway to her butter plate. My father slowly set his glass down. I watched his face, that familiar, etched map of sternness for any flicker of change. There was none. "MARSOC," he stated, the acronym flat and heavy. "The Raiders." "Yes, sir." He was silent for another long moment, his gaze fixed on me, dissecting me. I felt like a boot private on inspection, every flaw suddenly visible under the harsh light. "That's a long shot, Riley. A very long shot for anyone." "I know it's competitive. I've been training for it. My PFT scores are." He cut me off with a wave of his hand, dismissing the perfect 300s, the top-tier swim quals, the months of extra ruck marches I'd logged before the sun came up. "Scores on a piece of paper. They don't mean anything, not there." He leaned forward slightly, and his voice lowered, not with concern, but with a blunt, almost brutal certainty. "You're a good Marine, Riley, a competent officer, but you won't be tough enough. Not like them. It's a different kind of hard." The air went out of the room. The words weren't shouted. They were delivered with the calm, unshakable conviction of a man stating a fundamental law of physics. Gravity exists. The sky is blue. You will fail. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, a dangerous mix of shame and a fury so bright it was blinding. I wanted to yell, to argue, to list every accomplishment, every ounce of pain I'd endured and overcome. But I didn't. I saw the faint, almost imperceptible shake of my mother's head, a silent plea from the peacemaker. Arguing would only prove his point. Emotional, unstable, not tough enough. So I did what I had learned to do a long time ago. I internalized it. I let the words sink in, let them burn, let them become fuel. I met his gaze and held it, my own eyes gone just as flat and hard as his. "We'll see," I said, my voice dangerously calm. He gave that same small, dismissive nod and returned to his chicken. The conversation was over. The verdict was in. I had just been found wanting yet again. 2 weeks later, I left home, his trident pin cold and heavy in my pocket, a stolen standard to live up to or die trying. A sharp, guttural bark ripped me back to the present. The sun was just starting to bleed light over the horizon, outlining the man who had spoken. He stood before us, a silhouette of pure menace, his campaign cover pulled low over his eyes. This was Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Thorne. We'd all heard the stories, the legends, the nightmares. "My name is Gunnery Sergeant Thorne," he said, his voice not loud, but carrying with it a chilling, penetrative quality that silenced the last of the shifting feet and nervous breaths. "For those of you who manage to still be here in a few days, I will be your primary instructor. For the rest of you, well, you'll be a memory. A faint, disappointing smudge on my otherwise impeccable record of finding the weak and weeding them out." He began to pace slowly in front of our line, his eyes scanning us like a predator assessing a herd. "I see a lot of hopeful faces, a lot of pride, a lot of paper scores and fitness reports that got you this ticket to ride." He stopped. His head turned, and his gaze, dark and utterly devoid of warmth, locked directly onto me. It felt like being targeted by a laser designator. I held my breath, my father's pin a brand in my fist. "Some of you," he said, his words dripping with icy contempt, "do not belong here. You are a mistake that needs correcting. My job is to find you, and I am very, very good at my job." The gaze lingered for a heartbeat longer, then moved on, leaving a cold spot in its wake. The message was received, loud and clear. He'd seen my file, seen my name, and drawn a circle around it. The daughter of a retired master sergeant, a legacy case, a probable problem. The first evolution was a blur of controlled chaos and pain. Log PT, not the individual logs of boot camp, but a massive, waterlogged telephone pole meant for a team of 8. My team, 7 men and myself, grunted and swore as we hefted the monstrous thing onto our shoulders. The bark was rough, digging into my collarbone even through the fabric of my shirt. The weight was immediate and immense, a crushing force that wanted to drive me into the soft earth. "Move," an instructor screamed, his face inches from ours. "You think the enemy gives you time to get comfortable? Move." We ran, or rather, we stumbled in a ragged, agonized clump, the log bouncing and shifting on our shoulders. Every step was a negotiation with gravity. My legs burned. My lungs screamed. The world shrank to the few feet of muddy ground in front of me and the crushing weight on my back. And then the log shifted violently. The man in front of me, a big guy named Hernandez, hit a soft patch of sand and his knee buckled. He cried out and his end of the log dropped. The sudden, uneven redistribution of weight was catastrophic. The full force of the log slammed down on me and the man to my right, driving the air from my lungs in a sickening whoosh. I stumbled, my boots sliding in the muck, and for a terrifying second I was going down. This was it. Failure in the first hour. But the man to my right, a guy with a determined set to his jaw and sweat already plastering his dark hair to his forehead, didn't buckle. He let out a grunt that was more of a roar, and with a tremendous heave, he shoved upward, taking on an impossible share of the weight. He didn't look at me. He didn't say a word. He just absorbed the shock. He gave me the half-second I needed to find my footing, to reset my legs, and to shove back up. We kept moving, a lurching, painful machine once more. When we finally dropped the log at the finish point, my body was trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. I turned to the man who had saved me from eating dirt. I was still breathing too hard to speak, but I managed a sharp, grateful nod. He was bent over, hands on his knees, sucking in huge gulps of air. He looked up, saw my nod, and gave me a lopsided, breathless grin. "Ben Carter," he wheezed, sticking out a muddy hand. I shook it, Riley Sloan. "Yeah, I know," he said, still grinning. "The Master Sergeant's kid, Gunny Thorne's favorite already." The way he said it wasn't accusatory, it was commiserating, an observation of a shared, shitty reality. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded again. But the simple act of solidarity, the wordless taking of weight, had forged a tiny, tentative bond. An ally. In this place, it felt more valuable than water. There was no time to rest. The forced march began immediately. 55 pounds on our backs, rifles in hand, under a sun that had now climbed high and hot into the sky. Thorne's voice was a constant, corrosive presence in our ears, pointing out every stumble, every grimace, every second of hesitation. My father's words became a mantra in time, with my boots hitting the dirt. Not tough enough. Different kind of hard. Each one was a prod, a spark that kept my legs moving long after the muscle fatigue had set in. I focused on the pain, welcomed it, used it to drown out everything else. The fear, the doubt, the memory of Thorne's cold stare. The miles blurred together. The pack straps sawed into my shoulders. My feet were already developing a constellation of hot spots that would soon be full-blown blisters. The world shrank to the next step, and the next, and the next. I didn't see the route. My boot caught on it, and I pitched forward, hitting the trail hard on my hands and knees. The impact jarred every tooth in my head. For a moment, I just stayed there, kneeling in the dirt, the weight of the pack pressing me down, the urge to just stay down, to quit, a sweet and tempting whisper. A hand appeared in my vision. Ben, he stopped. He'd broken stride to help me up. I looked past his hand to the instructors. Thorne was watching, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable behind his sunglasses. Price, that was the fuel I needed. I ignored Ben's hand, shoved myself back to my feet with a grunt, and lurched forward back into the line, not looking back. I couldn't afford to accept help. Not here. Not now. It would be noted. It would be used. We finished the march in a ragged, stumbling line of exhaustion. We were allowed to drop our packs and were given a 5-minute break to hydrate. I leaned against a Humvee, my entire body trembling, sucking warm water from my canteen. I was spent, hollowed out, but I'd finished. The instructors moved among us, a pack of wolves, and then Thorne was in front of me again. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked me up and down, taking in my filthy uniform, my shaking hands, the dirt smeared on my face from my fall. He leaned in close, his voice low enough that only I could hear it over the panting of the other candidates. The smell of his coffee breath mixed with the scent of his starched uniform. "I saw that, Sloan," he murmured, his tone almost conversational. "The fall, you know what I didn't see?" He paused, letting the question hang in the air between us. "I didn't see the heart of a raider. I saw a little girl trying to prove something to her daddy. This isn't about him. It's about the man or woman to your left and right. And right now, I'm not sure you even see them, so I'll ask you plainly, why are you here?" "Because from where I'm standing, you're just taking up a slot for someone who belongs." He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and walked away, leaving his question hanging in the air like poison gas. The words hit with the force of a physical blow, landing directly on top of the old, brittle foundation of my father's dismissal. The two criticisms fused together, a superheated alloy of doubt that threatened to melt my resolve entirely. I looked down at my hand, still clenched around my father's trident. I slowly, deliberately forced my fingers to open. The pin sat in my palm, its edges leaving angry red indentations. It wasn't a symbol of a standard to achieve. It was a shackle. Thorne was wrong, my father was wrong. I wasn't here for him, I was here for me. But as I stood there, trembling and alone in a sea of exhausted, suffering Marines, the conviction felt thin and fragile. A whispered defiance against the roaring, certain truth of the two toughest men I had ever known. The gauntlet had been thrown down long before I ever arrived here. Now, buried in the dirt, I had to decide if I had what it took to pick it up. The cold was different here. Not the clean, biting chill of the ocean that seeped into your bones during hydrographic reconnaissance, but a damp, cloying cold that seemed to rise from the very soil of the mock POW camp. 3 months in, and the training pipeline had shifted from brute force physical endurance to the more insidious art of psychological survival. SEER School was its own special kind of hell, a theater of controlled misery where the stage was your own mind, and the props were hunger, exhaustion, and fear. I sat on a rough-hewn wooden stool in a barren room, the scent of wet pine and mildew thick in the air. A single, bare bulb swung from a wire overhead, casting erratic shadows that danced across the face of the instructor playing my interrogator. He was a staff sergeant with a flat, unreadable expression and eyes that missed nothing. They called him the accountant. "Your service number, Sloan," he said, his voice a monotone devoid of malice or encouragement. It was just a fact, a request for data. I gave it to him, the digits rolling off my tongue automatically. Name, rank, service number. That was the script, the only script I was allowed. And your unit's current operational deployment? I cannot answer that question, sir. This was the dance. He would ask, I would refuse. The goal wasn't to hold out forever, that was a fantasy. The goal was to endure, to control the breakdown, to make the cost of extracting information higher than its value. It was a mental game of chess played on a board of raw nerves. The accountant shifted his weight, the movement slight, but in the stark silence of the room, it sounded like a landslide. Your father was a SEAL, wasn't he? Master Sergeant David Sloan. He let the name hang in the air between us. This was the part where they probed for leverage. I knew him, tough bastard, old school, bet he's proud, his little girl following in his footsteps. The words were a precisely aimed dart, designed to find the chink in my armor. A flicker of the dinner table argument, of the cold finality in my father's eyes, crossed my mind. You're not tough enough, Riley. I felt the phantom pressure of his trident pin, which I'd left secured in my footlocker for this very reason. It was too personal, too potent a vulnerability. I locked the memory away, shoving it down deep where the accountant couldn't reach it. I cannot answer that question, sir. He leaned forward, his face now inches from mine. His breath smelled of coffee and stale crackers. He must have told you stories, given you advice. What did he say about resisting interrogation? Did he teach you his tricks? The irony was a bitter pill. My father's only lesson on toughness had been a lesson in perceived deficiency. I focused on the grain of the wood in the floorboards, tracing the lines with my eyes, building a map in my mind to escape the room I was physically trapped in. This was my strength. The physical pain of the past months, the log PT, the endless runs in soft sand, the freezing surf, was nothing compared to this quiet, gnawing pressure. My body was a tool. My mind was the weapon. I let my breathing slow, falling into the rhythm I used on the rifle range, the world narrowing to the space between heartbeats. The accountant tried a few more angles, prodding at family, at loyalty, at fear. Each time my answer was the same rote refusal. I didn't react to the taunts about my father, didn't flinch when he implied I was only here because of a last name. I became a wall. After what felt like hours, but was likely only 45 minutes, he sighed, a sound of genuine, almost bored resignation. He made a note on his clipboard. All right, Sloan, get out. As I stood, my legs stiff and cold, I caught a glimpse of his notation. Next to my name, he'd scribbled 2 words, exceptional composure. It wasn't praise, it was an assessment. But it was fuel. I stored it away with the other fragments of criticism and doubt, a new piece of coal for the furnace inside me. Later that night, on a simulated patrol through the dense, dark woods, the victory felt distant and hollow. The cold was back, the kind that made your teeth ache. Ben Carter was walking point, his silhouette a familiar, steady presence ahead of me. We moved as a team, a single organism with multiple eyes and ears, but the silence mandated by the exercise forced us into the prisons of our own thoughts. We set up a hasty patrol base in a small depression, taking turns on watch. My shift ended, and I tapped Ben's shoulder, slipping into the relative warmth of the 2-man fighting hole we'd scraped out of the leaf litter. He settled in beside me, his body a solid, welcome presence in the oppressive dark. For a long time, we just sat, listening to the sounds of the forest and the distant, imagined sounds of the aggressor force. You okay? He whispered, his voice barely a breath. After the interrogation today, the accountant looked impressed, and he never looks impressed. I shrugged, a gesture he probably felt more than saw. It's just a game, you play your part, I play mine. Bullshit, he said softly. He went after your dad, didn't he? They always go after the family. The simple empathy in his voice was a chisel tap on the dam I kept so carefully constructed. I found myself telling him, in fragmented sentences, about the dinner. Not all of it, but the heart of it. The weight of my father's doubt, the trident pin I carried not as a lucky charm, but as a reminder of a debt I needed to repay to my own self-worth. Ben was quiet for a moment, digesting this. Then he said, My old man is a high school football coach in Ohio. Thinks all this, he gestured vaguely at the darkness, the rifles, is a bit dramatic. He wanted me to take over the family hardware store. He chuckled, a low, warm sound in the cold. I joined to get away from selling nails and light bulbs. My motivation is a lot less epic. I almost smiled. It sounds simpler. It is, but it also means I don't have a ghost standing over my shoulder, judging every step. He shifted, pulling the edge of his poncho liner tighter around us. The shared body heat was a small defiance against the night. You know, back in boot camp, during the crucible, our drill instructor told us something I've never forgotten. He said, "Tough isn't about not feeling cold, privates. It's about sharing your body heat." The words landed differently than my father's or Thorne's. They weren't a challenge or a critique, they were an invitation. For a moment, the constant, driving pressure in my chest eased. The need to prove myself alone, to be the unbreakable individual my father demanded, felt suddenly, profoundly lonely. "He's wrong, you know," Ben continued. "Your dad. Toughness isn't a wall you build around yourself. That just makes you brittle. Real toughness is flexible. It's knowing when to stand firm and when to lean. It's trust." I didn't answer. I just let the warmth from his shoulder seep into mine, a tangible proof of his words. It was a dangerous comfort. It felt like something that could be taken away. The following week, Gunnery Sergeant Thorne seemed determined to do exactly that. We were in the middle of a team-based problem-solving drill, assembling a complex weapon system from scattered parts under a time hack. My fingers, numb with cold, fumbled a spring. It was a tiny mistake, instantly corrected, but Thorne's hawk-like eyes saw everything. "Sloan," his voice cracked like a whip, "Butterfingers today, get over here." I jogged to where he stood, apart from the team. His face was granite. "That little display of incompetence just cost your team 30 seconds. You think this is a game? You think they have time to carry your weight?" "No, Gunnery Sergeant." "Apparently you do. Since you can't seem to function as part of a group, you'll work alone. See that pile of sandbags over there? I want them moved, to the other side of the compound. By hand, one at a time. The rest of you," he barked, turning to the team, "continue the exercise. Carter, you're now team lead." A hot flush of shame washed over me. I glanced at Ben, who gave me a barely perceptible nod before turning back to the weapon parts. Isolation was Thorne's favorite tool. He was a master at breaking the very cohesion he demanded, testing individual spirit by removing its support system. For the next hour, as the gray sky threatened rain, I moved sandbags. Each one was a dead weight, the rough burr scraping against my already raw hands. With each trip across the compound, I had to pass my team. I saw them working together, a synchronized machine, Ben directing with a quiet confidence. I heard the clink of metal as they successfully assembled the weapon, a sound of unity from which I was excluded. Thorne stood watching me, his arms crossed, a silent monument to judgment. It was a perfect, cruel punishment. It wasn't the physical labor that broke me down, it was the spectacle of belonging from which I was barred. It made Ben's words about shared body heat feel like a taunt. That evening, mail call delivered another carefully aimed blow. Among the letters was a single, stark white envelope with my father's precise, blocky handwriting. I took it to the relative privacy of my bunk and, by the dim beam of my red lens flashlight, read the brief contents. "Riley, your mother informs me you've progressed to seer. That school separates the serious from the tourists. I won't pretend to understand your commitment to this path, but I acknowledge your persistence. The easy thing would have been to quit months ago. Remember that the mind fails before the body. Do not become a liability to your team. I hope you know when to quit. D. Sloan." The paper trembled in my hand. It was so like him. A sliver of acknowledgement. "I acknowledge your persistence, poisoned by the familiar doubt. I hope you know when to quit." The words echoed in the small space, clashing violently with the memory of Ben's voice in the dark. Tough isn't about not feeling cold. It's about sharing your body heat. Which version of strength was real? The solitary, unforgiving standard my father embodied, or the communal resilience Ben offered? One demanded I prove I needed no one. The other suggested that needing others was the point. The conflict festered inside me during the final exercise of the phase, a brutal land navigation course through steep, unfamiliar terrain. We were tasked with hitting a series of coordinates under a strict timeline, carrying full combat loads. For the first few hours, the team moved well. We were a unit again, and I clung to that feeling, the simple mechanics of map reading, pace counting, and security providing a welcome respite from my churning thoughts. Then the weather broke. The sky, which had been threatening all day, opened up with a vengeance. A cold, driving rain lashed down, turning trails into streams and obscuring visibility to mere feet. The wind howled, making communication a shouting match. We were behind schedule, slogging through the mud, our spirits sinking with the sun. We reached a ravine that wasn't on the map, a recent washout created by the storm. The designated route involved a long, time-consuming contour around its head. I studied the map, the plastic casing slick with rain, and then looked at the ravine itself. It was steep, but navigable. A direct descent and climb up the other side would save us at least an hour. "It's not on the route," Ben yelled over the wind, peering at my map. "Thorn will crucify us if we deviate." "The route is a suggestion to get us from point A to point B," I shouted back. "The objective is to hit all points on time. This is the only way we make up the time we've lost. It's a calculated risk." I saw the doubt in the eyes of the other two men on the team, but Ben looked from the map to the ravine to my face. He trusted me. "Sloane's right," he said, his decision made. "We go down, fast and careful, watch your footing." The descent was treacherous, a controlled slide through mud and loose rock. Halfway down, Ben's foot caught on a root hidden under the sludge. I heard a sharp cry, followed by a sickening crack. He went down hard, clutching his leg. We scrambled to him. Even in the dim light, the unnatural angle of his lower leg was obvious. The rest was a blur of urgent, practiced action. I called in the medevac on the radio, my voice surprisingly calm despite the panic clawing at my throat. We secured Ben, splinting his leg as best we could while the wind and rain battered us. The helicopter arrived in a roar of noise and downdraft, and within minutes they were loading him in. He gave me a thumbs up, his face pale with pain, before the doors closed and the bird disappeared into the storm. We completed the navigation course, the two remaining of us moving like automatons. We were hours late. Gunnery Sergeant Thorne was waiting for us at the final point, a stark figure illuminated by the headlights of a Humvee. He listened to my terse after-action report, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he took a step closer. "A calculated risk, Sloane," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You deviated from the prescribed route. Your calculation resulted in a candidate with a broken leg being airlifted to a naval hospital. You prioritized time over procedure over safety. You broke the team. Was the hour you saved worth Carter's career?" The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. He was twisting it. He was making Ben's accident, a simple piece of bad luck in horrific conditions, my fault. My decision, born of a desire to succeed for the team, was being framed as reckless individualism. I wanted to scream that it was the storm, the route, the terrible luck, that my plan was sound, but I saw the cold certainty in his eyes. He wasn't interested in my justification. This was the lesson. As I stood there, soaked to the skin and shivering, the image of Ben's pained face superimposed itself over Thorne's disapproving glare. My father's letter felt like a lead weight in my pocket. "I hope you know when to quit." Thorne's scorn was a confirmation of my father's deepest suspicion, that my judgment was flawed, that I was, ultimately, a liability. The resilience I had built over 3 months, the mental fortitude that had impressed the accountant, crumbled into a pile of ash and doubt. I had no answer for Thorne. I just stood in the pounding rain, alone, the warmth of shared body heat a distant, forgotten memory. The world had shrunk to the sound of my own breathing, a ragged, rhythmic rasp that seemed to echo inside the cage of my ribs. Each inhale was a conscious effort, a battle against the leaden weight in my chest. Each exhale was a small victory. My feet, swollen and numb inside my battered boots, moved with a mind of their own, one in front of the other on the muddy track that seemed to stretch into an infinite, dark oblivion. It was the third night, the final push of the final evolution. 72 hours without sleep, without rest, just a continuous, grinding simulation of a combat mission that had pushed our class of 20 down to a ragged dozen. The air was cold and damp, clinging to my skin like a shroud. The only light came from the sliver of a moon overhead and the faint red glow of our helmet-mounted NVGs, casting the world in a ghostly monochrome. To my left, Ben Carter's silhouette was a study in exhaustion, his shoulders slumped, the weight of his pack seeming to bow him forward. We didn't speak. Words were a currency we could no longer afford. Communication was reduced to grunts, hand signals, and the shared, desperate understanding in each other's eyes when we dared to glance up. This was the breaking point. Not a dramatic, cinematic climax, but a slow, meticulous unraveling. My mind felt like a radio picking up static, snatches of memory and hallucination bleeding into the present. I'd see my father's stern face superimposed over the back of the Marine in front of me, his silent disapproval a more potent fuel than any energy bar. I'd hear Gunny Thorne's voice, not from his position somewhere in the darkness ahead, but from the interrogation shed months prior, cold and probing. "Your father's legacy is a long shadow, Sloane. Are you sure you're not just trying to prove something to a man who will never be impressed?" I shook my head, a clumsy, heavy motion, trying to clear the cobwebs. That was the point of this whole hellish journey, wasn't it? To strip you down to your raw components, to see what was left when the body quit and the mind began to betray you. Resilience. That's what they were testing. My own personal brand, forged in the fire of my father's critiques, was the only thing keeping me upright. Every stumble, every wave of nausea, every whispered doubt from my own brain was just another piece of criticism to internalize, to burn. "Sloane," the voice was a dry croak from Ben. I tilted my head, the movement sending a fresh ache down my neck. He gestured weakly ahead. The trail was beginning to slope upwards, a steep, rocky incline that disappeared into the blackness. The logistical nightmare, they called it, the final obstacle before the extraction point. "Yeah," I managed, the word tasting like dust. "Almost there." A humorless, breathy sound escaped him. It might have been a laugh. Define almost. We began the climb. It was less climbing and more a grueling hand-over-hand scramble. Rocks, made slippery by the pervasive dampness, shifted under our boots. The straps of my pack dug into my shoulders like knives, and the rifle slung across my chest felt as heavy as a log. My quadriceps screamed with every lunge upward. The line of Marines became a slow-moving serpent of misery, punctuated by grunts of effort and the clatter of dislodged stones. I was focused on a patch of loose gravel just beyond my next foothold, my entire universe condensed to that single, treacherous step when I heard it. A sharp, sickening crack, like a dry branch snapping, followed immediately by a choked-off gasp that was pure, undiluted agony. It wasn't a sound you could mistake for a rock fall or equipment failure. It was organic, final. I twisted around, my heart hammering against my sternum. Ben was down. He'd been just a few feet behind me, and now he was sprawled on the incline, his body contorted. His face, visible in the greenish glow of my NVGs, was a mask of shock and pain, his teeth clenched so hard I thought they might shatter. "Carter's down," someone shouted, the voice cracking with fatigue. The line stuttered to a halt. For a moment, there was only the sound of labored breathing and Ben's sharp, hissed inhalations. Then, as if materializing from the shadows themselves, Gunnery Sergeant Thorne was there. He didn't run, he simply appeared, a monolithic presence in the gloom. He stood over Ben, his expression unreadable behind his own NVGs. "What's the problem, candidate?" Thorne's voice was flat, devoid of any emotion. It was the same tone he'd used when he'd told me my land navigation was marginally acceptable. Ben tried to speak, but only a strangled groan came out. He gestured weakly toward his left leg, which was bent at an angle that was fundamentally wrong. Even in the low light, the swelling around his ankle was already visible. Thorne knelt, his movements economical. He didn't touch Ben, just observed. Compound fracture, tibia, maybe fibula with it. He straightened up, his gaze sweeping over the rest of us, frozen in place on the hillside. "Candidate Carter is now a casualty, a liability. Secure his weapon and ammunition. The mission clock is still running. Move out." The words hung in the cold air, absolute and unforgiving. They were an order, the logical, tactical order. In a real combat scenario, under extreme duress, a single injured man could compromise the entire team. I knew the doctrine. I'd been taught the cold calculus of survival. But this wasn't just doctrine. This was Ben, who'd shared his rations with me when I'd lost mine during a river crossing. Ben, whose stupid jokes had kept the darkness at bay during long, silent watches. Ben, who had whispered, "You've got this, Sloane," right before I'd stepped into the accountant's shed. Leaving him was not an option. It wasn't a decision I arrived at through a rational thought process. It was a truth that ignited in my gut, a fire that burned away the exhaustion and the doubt. I took a step down the slope toward Thorne. My legs were trembling so violently I wasn't sure they would hold me. Gunny, request permission to improvise a litter and evacuate candidate Carter. Thorne turned his head slowly toward me. I felt the weight of his stare even through the lenses of his goggles. Request denied, Sloan. You have your orders. The objective is 5 clicks north. Your team is to secure it. That is the mission. The rest of the candidates were watching me, their faces hollowed out by fatigue and indecision. They were waiting for a lead. I was the ranking candidate left. I shook my head, a stubborn, defiant gesture. With all due respect, Gunnery Sergeant, a raider doesn't leave a brother behind. The words came out stronger than I felt. The mission fails if we leave him, sir. The sir was an afterthought, a habit drilled into me, but there was no deference in my tone. This was a direct challenge. Thorne took a step toward me, closing the distance until I could smell the faint scent of coffee on his breath. This isn't about brotherhood, Sloan. This is about toughness, about making the hard call. The call that saves the most lives. Your sentimentality is going to get the rest of your team killed. Is that the kind of leader you want to be? The one who fails because she's too soft? His words were a scalpel, expertly wielded, probing the exact insecurity I'd carried with me since I was a girl trying to measure up to my father's impossible standards. Soft. It was the one thing I could never be. But something had shifted. The interrogation, the months of hell, this final, crushing fatigue, it had sandblasted me down to something new. The need to prove my individual toughness, to prove I wasn't soft, felt small and hollow compared to the man gasping in the dirt behind me. The hard call isn't leaving him, Gunny, I said, my voice low but clear in the tense silence. The hard call is figuring out how to carry him and still complete the mission. That's the toughness that matters. That's leadership. I turned my back on Thorne, a gesture of such profound insubordination it felt like stepping off a cliff. I looked at the other candidates. Miller Jacobs, get your ponchos out. We're making a litter. Sanchez, you're on point. Let's move. For a heart-stopping second, nobody moved. They looked from me to Thorne, waiting for the explosion. Then, a miracle. Miller slowly shrugged his pack off. Jacobs followed. The spell was broken. Thorne didn't say a word. He just stood there, a statue of judgment, as we worked with frantic, clumsy hands to fashion a makeshift stretcher from ponchos and sturdy branches. We lifted Ben onto it as gently as our exhausted, shaking limbs would allow. He cried out as his leg was jostled, a sound that tore at me, but then he gritted his teeth and nodded. "Thanks, Riley," he whispered. His use of my first name, a forbidden intimacy in this formal setting, solidified my resolve. We started moving again, a clumsy, slow-moving beast with 8 legs. 4 of us carried the litter, the others forming a defensive perimeter. The pace was agonizingly slow. Every step was a fresh torment. The weight of Ben, combined with our own gear, was crushing. My arms felt like they were being torn from their sockets. The 5 kilometers to the objective felt like 50. Thorne and the other instructors shadowed us, silent phantoms in the woods. They didn't interfere, didn't offer help, didn't say a word. Their silence was more unnerving than any shouted critique. It took us over 4 hours to cover that final distance. The sky was beginning to lighten from black to a deep, bruised gray when we stumbled into the clearing that marked the objective, a simple orange flag planted in the ground. We set Ben down with painstaking care and then simply collapsed around him, too spent for celebration, for relief, for anything but the primal need to stop moving. I sat on the damp earth, my head between my knees, fighting the urge to vomit. I heard heavy boots stop in front of me. I looked up. It was Thorne. He had removed his NVGs. In the dim pre-dawn light, his face was etched with fatigue, but his eyes were different. The flinty, impersonal harshness was gone. In its place was something else, something that looked like respect. "Sloan," he said, his voice quiet for my ears only. "For months I've been pushing you, harder than the others. You thought it was because you're a woman, didn't you? That I didn't think you belonged here." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The assumption had been a given, a constant, bitter companion. He gave a short, sharp shake of his head. "It was never about that. I've seen plenty of women tough enough for this. I was testing you because I saw your father in you. That relentless drive to prove yourself, no matter the cost. That's a powerful engine, Sloan, but it's a dangerous one. It can make you selfish. It can make you leave people behind in your rush to prove you're not the weak link." He gestured to Ben, who was now being tended to by a corpsman who had appeared as if from thin air. "Today, you proved me wrong. You proved that your toughness isn't just for you, it's for the man next to you. That's the only kind of toughness that matters in this line of work. The mission is important, but the people are why we do it." He turned and walked away, leaving me sitting in the mud, my mind reeling. The antagonist of my last 8 months had just revealed himself as the most perceptive mentor I'd ever had. The criticism I'd used as fuel had been a carefully calibrated tool all along. The realization was as disorienting as the exhaustion. Later, after we'd been trucked back to the main camp, after the corpsman had confirmed Ben had a clean break and was being evacuated to the base hospital, we were granted a precious 30 minutes of personal time. A chance to shower and make a single phone call. I stood under a spray of scalding water, watching 8 months of grime and sweat swirl down the drain, but I couldn't wash away the emotional vertigo. Wrapped in a towel, shivering in the crisp morning air, I picked up the field phone in the common area. My fingers, numb and clumsy, dialed the number I knew by heart. It rang twice before she picked up. "Riley," my mother's voice was soft with sleep and immediate concern. "Honey, is everything okay? It's so early." "Yeah, Mom, it's okay. We just finished a big evolution." I leaned my forehead against the cool cinderblock wall, closing my eyes. I wanted to tell her about Ben, about Thorn, about the crushing weight and the profound shift inside me, but the words wouldn't come. All that emerged was a shaky sigh. She was silent for a moment, and I could picture her sitting up in bed, the phone pressed to her ear, her kind eyes full of worry. "It's almost over, sweetheart. You're so close." "I know," I took a breath. "How's Dad?" There was another pause, longer this time. I heard her take a deep breath. Your father is your father, Riley. You know that, but he's not what you think." A flicker of the old resentment sparked. "What does that mean? That he's still waiting for me to quit?" "No," she said, her voice firm now, clearer. "It's the opposite. He watches the news every single night, Riley. Not the regular news, the military news, the updates from Pendleton, any scrap of information he can find. He doesn't say a word. He just sits in his chair with that stern face of his and he watches. I asked him once after you called about that Sear School business why he put himself through it." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "He said, I need to know she's safe." And then he said, "I'm terrified, Sarah. I'm terrified I wasn't a good enough father to prepare her for this, that I made her too hard or not hard enough." He's not doubting you, Riley. He's afraid. He's afraid of the world he taught you to conquer, and he's afraid he failed you. The phone felt heavy in my hand. The cinderblock wall against my forehead was the only thing keeping me upright. All the arguments, the stony silences, the constant, grinding pressure to be better, stronger, tougher, I had always interpreted it as a lack of faith, a prediction of my failure. But what if it was the opposite? What if it was the desperate, clumsy attempt of a man, shaped by a world of hard choices and harder losses, to armor his daughter against a danger he understood all too well? The realization didn't erase the years of hurt, but it layered them with something new, something complex and aching. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It was the first crack of light in a door I had thought was permanently sealed. I stood there in the silent hallway, the hum of the line in my ear, the image of my father not as a stone-faced judge, but as a frightened man alone in a darkened living room, watching the news and waiting for a sign that his little girl was safe. The morning air was sharp and clean, carrying the distant scent of cut grass and salt from the sea. It was a world away from the mud-choked, smoke-filled air of the final field problem just 9 months ago. 9 months. It felt like a lifetime. Standing at parade rest on the sun-warmed asphalt of the grinder, the starched collar of my dress blues chafing my neck, I could still feel the ghost of that exhaustion deep in my bones. But it was just a ghost. The hollowed-out vessel I had been was now filled with something solid, something that had weight and substance. To my right, Ben Carter stood, balanced on his crutches, his own uniform perfectly tailored to accommodate the cast on his leg. He caught my eye and gave me a small, almost imperceptible wink. The dry croak of a man on the verge of collapse was gone, replaced by his familiar, easy confidence. The fracture he'd sustained on the final hump, a stress injury that had finally given way under the relentless pressure, had kept him from walking across the stage, but it hadn't kept him from earning his place here. We'd carried him, figuratively and then literally, the last few miles. Gunny Thorne had watched us, his face an unreadable mask, but he hadn't stopped us. That was the first clue. A platform was set up before our small, ragged formation of 12. We had started with 20. The empty spaces where the others should have been standing were a silent testament to the cost. The sun glinted off the brass of the band's instruments, and the colors of the flag snapped in the breeze. It was all ceremony and polish, a stark contrast to the gritty, visceral reality of what we had endured to get here. The commanding general's speech was a blur of formalities and proud platitudes. I heard the words fortitude, resolve, and the few, the proud, but they bounced off the focused stillness inside me. My attention was fixed on the small, velvet-lined box a sergeant major held. Inside, I knew, were the pins, the Raider insignia, the object that had been a distant, almost mythical grail for so long. Then it was our names, called one by one. Each step forward was measured, crisp. The general shook each hand, offered congratulations, and the sergeant major presented the box. When my name echoed across the grinder, Lieutenant Riley Sloan, I moved automatically, my body executing the drill with a precision that felt both learned and innate. The general's handshake was firm, his smile genuine. Congratulations, Lieutenant. Hell of an achievement. But the real moment came after. As I turned to return to my place, Gunnery Sergeant Thorne, standing rigidly at the end of the receiving line, extended his hand. His grip was like iron, crushing, meant to be remembered. He leaned in slightly, his voice a low, gravelly rumble meant for my ears alone. Sloan, he said, his eyes, usually chips of flint, held a strange, unfamiliar light. You're stubborn as hell, but you finally learned it's not about you. Good job. The words were simple, blunt, typical Thorne, but they landed with the force of a sledgehammer. It's not about you. It was the lesson he'd been trying to beat into me, quite literally, since day one. The criticism I'd internalized, the fuel I'd used to push through every sleepless night and every muscle-tearing evolution, had been aimed at this single truth. My father's voice in my head had always been about proving my worth, my toughness. Thorne's voice, his brutal, uncompromising tutelage, had been about shredding that selfish shell to reveal the Marine underneath, the one who would carry a teammate's pack, who would pour her last canteen into a parched mouth, who would rather break than let the team fail. He wasn't just acknowledging that I'd passed, he was acknowledging that I'd understood. I managed a stiff, "Thank you, Gunnery Sergeant," and returned to my place, the small, heavy pin box feeling insignificant compared to the weight of his acknowledgement. The ceremony concluded with a pass in review. As we marched, or in Ben's case, maneuvered with sharp precision on his crutches, my eyes scanned the small crowd of families gathered on the sidelines. I found them immediately. My mother, Sarah, stood beaming, her hands clasped under her chin, tears streaming openly down her face. She was pure, unfiltered pride, a radiant sun of validation I had always been able to count on, even in silence. And next to her, David Sloan, retired Master Sergeant. He stood at a modified parade rest, his spine straight, his hands clasped behind his back. But his face undid me. The stern, impassive mask I had spent a lifetime trying to crack was gone. In its place was a raw, unguarded expression I had never seen before. His jaw was set, but his eyes, fixed directly on me, were glistening, shimmering with unshed tears. There was no criticism there, no silent tally of my flaws. Instead, I saw awe, and beneath that, a profound, heartbreaking regret. In that single, locked gaze, 2 years of distance and a lifetime of misunderstanding collapsed. After the dismissal, the formation broke into a chaos of hugs, backslaps, and photographs. Ben pulled me into a one-armed crush of a hug. "We did it, Sloan," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Damn, we actually did it." "You barely did it, Carter," I joked, tapping the cast on his leg. "Had to make a dramatic exit." "Someone had to keep things interesting," he shot back with a grin. "Go on, your parents are waiting." I made my way over to them. My mother enveloped me in a hug that smelled of perfume and home. "Oh, Riley," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I am so proud of you." She held me at arm's length, her eyes sweeping over my uniform. "Just look at you." Then I turned to my father. He was standing a pace back, giving us our moment. He seemed older suddenly, the lines on his face deeper. The silence between us was a physical thing, heavy with all the words he'd never said and all the ones I'd stopped waiting for. "Dad," I said. He stepped forward. His hand came up, hesitated for a second, and then he placed it on my shoulder. The gesture was awkward, unpracticed. "Riley," he said, his voice rougher than usual. He cleared his throat. That was something else. It was the most effusive praise he'd ever given me. We took pictures. My mother insisted on every possible combination. Me alone, me with Ben, me with my parents. My father stood stiffly beside me, his posture never relaxing, but his eyes kept drifting to the Raider pin now fixed to my uniform. He looked at it not with the covetousness of a collector, but with a kind of reverence. A week later, I was back in my childhood home. The dress blues were hanging carefully in the closet of my old room, but the pin was on my nightstand. The house was quiet, filled with the comfortable silence of a Sunday afternoon. My mother was at the hospital for a shift, and the scent of the roast she'd left cooking for dinner filled the air. I found my father out back on the patio, staring at the neat, rectangular lawn he'd manicured to within an inch of its life. He held a glass of iced tea, the condensation dripping down the sides. He didn't turn as I slid the glass door open and stepped out. "Mind if I join you?" He shook his head, gesturing to the empty chair beside him. I sat. The silence stretched, but it was different now. It wasn't the hostile, judgmental silence of our last dinner here 2 years ago, the one that had ended with me slamming the door on my way out. This silence was contemplative, almost peaceful, punctuated by the chirping of sparrows in the oak tree. He took a long sip of his tea. "Your mother's showing the photo album to Mrs. Gable next door," he said finally. "Must be on the 100th time." I smiled. "She's earned it." "She has." He fell quiet again, his gaze fixed on the far fence line. I could see the gears turning, the old man wrestling with something big, something that didn't have a proper military manual. He was a man who dealt in orders and objectives, not emotions and admissions. "I've been thinking," he began, then stopped. He set his glass down on the wrought iron table with a definitive click. "About what you said, that night." I remembered it with perfect clarity. The raised voices. Me yelling that his definition of tough was broken. Him stating coldly that the world wasn't interested in my feelings. "I remember," I said softly. He nodded, his jaw working. He still couldn't look at me. "I watched you out there, at graduation, and I read the write-up in the base paper about the final exercise." He paused, gathering himself. "It said your team was the only one that didn't leave a man behind, even when it cost you. Even when it meant carrying Lieutenant Carter for the last leg." "It wasn't a choice," I said. "He's one of us." "That's just it," he said, his voice dropping, becoming almost gentle. "That's what I never understood." He finally turned to look at me, and his eyes were the same as they were on the grinder, raw and unshielded. "All those years, I thought I was making you tough. I thought toughness was a wall, impenetrable, self-sufficient. You didn't need anybody and nobody could get through. That's how I was raised. That's what the Corps taught me, or what I thought it taught me." He took a ragged breath. "I was wrong, Riley, completely, utterly wrong." The words hung in the air, simple and monumental, an admission I had never imagined hearing. "What you did, what you have, that's a different kind of tough. It's not a wall. It's a foundation. It's the kind of strength that lets you be vulnerable, that lets you care about your people so damn much you'll break yourself before you let them down." He shook his head, a gesture of pure, weary surrender. "That pin on your chest. You didn't earn that by being hard. You earned it by having a heart, a resilient heart. I was so busy looking for a reflection of myself in you, I failed to see the person you actually are." He looked down at his hands, the hands of a man who had fixed engines and saluted generals and never, ever shown weakness. "You're the toughest person I know, Riley. And I am so proud to be your father." The words dissolved the last of the armor around my own heart. There was no fuel left in his criticism because there was no criticism left. The furnace that had driven me for so long was cold, and in its place was a warm, steady light. I didn't say anything. There were no words adequate for that moment. I just stood up and stepped toward him. He rose slowly from his chair, and for the first time since I was a little girl, he opened his arms. We hugged. It was awkward at first, 2 soldiers unaccustomed to this kind of ceasefire, but then it settled into something real. His embrace was strong, but not rigid. It was an embrace of acceptance. I felt his chest shudder once, a single, suppressed sob, and I hugged him tighter. Later that evening, after dinner, I went upstairs to my room. The sun was setting, casting long, golden shadows across the faded high school swim team posters and the old bookshelf. I took my dress blues from the closet and laid them carefully on the bed. I picked up the raider pin from the nightstand. It was cold and heavy in my palm, an intricate piece of metal depicting a spear point, a star shell, and an orb. Symbols of a mission I was now sworn to undertake. I walked to the full-length mirror on the back of the door. I held the pin up to my chest, over my heart, but I didn't fasten it. I just looked at my reflection. The woman looking back at me had short, practical hair and eyes that had seen too much to be considered young anymore. There was a quiet certainty in her face, a peace that had been forged in the crucible of Thorne's demands, Ben's loyalty, and her father's flawed love. My toughness wasn't the absence of fear or pain. It wasn't a stoic refusal to feel. It was the resilience to feel it all, the doubt, the exhaustion, the fear of failing my team, and to keep moving forward anyway. It was the strength found in vulnerability, the power in admitting you need others, the courage to care deeply enough to carry the weight. It was a different kind of tough. And finally, looking at that reflection, the pin gleaming in the dying light, I knew it was mine.